The Trump administration is still searching for a narrative that can sell a rapidly escalating US-Israeli war with Iran to the American public. And so far, the president has framed this conflict on familiar terms: self-defense against what he calls a
dire threat to every American,
and even liberation, telling the Iranian people,
take over your government, it will be yours to take.
But those justifications are facing increasing scrutiny. Many foreign policy analysts say that there was no evidence for an imminent Iranian threat, and as civilian casualties from the bombing campaign rise, the moral case for intervention is also being challenged internationally. At home, public opinion appears skeptical as well. Several recent polls examined by the New York Times suggest that roughly 6 in 10 Americans oppose military action against Iran. So, as the traditional arguments for war, self-defense, democracy, and humanitarian intervention face pressure, the administration's messaging has begun to take another tone. For example, when the White House's website officially announced the start of the offensive that it called Operation Epic Fury, it prominently featured a New York Post headline aimed at Iran's leadership. Now, demonizing enemies is nothing new in wartime, but critics say that the rhetoric emerging from parts of this administration is beginning to frame this conflict in much broader terms. Not simply a geopolitical dispute, but a clash of civilizations. And that framing may carry far-reaching consequences. One example of this came 2 weeks before Operation Epic Fury began, at the Munich Security Conference. There, Secretary of State Marco Rubio described the United States and its European allies not simply as political partners, but as heirs to a shared Western civilization that was rooted in common history, colonial culture, and Christian faith.
We want allies who are proud of their culture and of their heritage, who understand that we are heirs to the same great and noble civilization, and who together with us are willing and able to defend it.
Now, since that speech, many of the European governments present in Munich have backed the US-Israeli war in Iran. The historic context here is important. Iran's current government came to power in the 1979 revolution, which overthrew the US and UK-backed Shah. Now, the Shah himself had been brought to power decades earlier, after a CIA and MI6-backed coup removed Iran's elected prime minister, Mohammad Mossadegh, following his attempt to nationalize the country's oil. So against this context, Rubio's language of civilizational struggle carries historical echoes. But apart from that, inside the US military, watchdog groups say that religious rhetoric surrounding this war is also raising alarms. The Military Religious Freedom Foundation says it logged more than 110 complaints from service members reporting that commanders were tying the Iran mission to Christian prophecy. And that tone might be influenced by the leadership of the Pentagon. Secretary of War Pete Hegseth once authored a book called American Crusade. He has Crusader-era symbolism tattooed on his body, and less than 2 weeks before bombing Iran, he invited a pastor who calls for a Christian theocracy in America and believes that women shouldn't have the right to vote to lead a Pentagon prayer service. And now, describing the campaign in Iran, Hegseth's rhetoric emphasizes overwhelming domination.
Iranian leaders looking up and seeing only U.S. and Israeli air power every minute of every day until we decide it's over. This was never meant to be a fair fight, and it is not a fair fight. We are punching them while they're down, which is exactly how it should be.
Language like this reinforces the perception that the conflict is no longer simply geopolitical, but something closer to that civilizational or even a theological war. And that framing plays directly into the strategy of the Islamic Republic. See, for decades, Iran's leadership has portrayed confrontation with the United States and Israel as part of a broader struggle between the Muslim world and Western and Zionist domination. And Iranian officials say that the assassination of the Ayatollah, who serves both as a political leader and one of the most influential Shia religious authorities, has strengthened this narrative. In an exclusive interview with Dropsite News, Iran's deputy foreign minister argued that the United States had transformed this conflict itself.
They turned this war of aggression into a sort of civilizational religious war. That was very reckless. So that's why the Muslims across the globe are badly mad.
It's moments like this that can trigger what political scientists call a rally around the flag effect, where external threats strengthen domestic support for a government that's already under pressure. And that reaction is already spreading beyond Iran. Protests have erupted in several countries with large Shia populations. In Karachi, US Marines opened fire on protesters who tried to storm the US embassy, killing 10, according to US officials. And for Tehran, these aftershocks are helping them transform the narrative of the war, from survival of a single embattled regime into a struggle that's tied to religion, identity, and resistance. And that shift could make this whole entire conflict a lot harder to contain. See, wars are fought not only with firepower, but with narratives. And right now, the Trump administration says its goals are straightforward: eliminate the regime that it views as a threat to the American people and support the Iranian people against their oppressive government. But the language surrounding the conflict from his other officials, from warning about defending Western civilization to religious rhetoric circulating within the parts of the military, suggests that this war is increasingly being framed in civilizational terms. And that framing carries risk. Because when conflicts are cast as battles between civilizations or faiths, compromise becomes far more difficult. And for Iran's leaders, it reinforces a message that they've already been promoting for decades: that their country is resisting Western domination, a narrative that's rooted in their history. So if this war begins to be understood through that lens, and not just the strategic confrontation, it becomes another chapter in what is a longer struggle with the West. Because once this conflict is framed as a war
against civilization itself,
asking for peace can begin to look like defeat.